I have a little bit of a theme with a couple of my interviews this week. Happy Monday. Welcome to another episode of the ToddCast. So today I'm interviewing McKay Coppins. It's a fascinating interview. He's a writer and reporter for The Atlantic, and he did the deepest of deep dives with incredible access on the fight for control of the Murdoch empire. James Murdoch in particular, the second eldest son of Rupert Murdoch, and the Murdoch children are in this big fight over whether to split up the empire equally or to, in Rupert's case, he's afraid of his more liberal children taking a piece of the Murdoch empire. So there's an ideological aspect to all of these things. Yes, if you're wondering, this is the story of succession in real life. Well, certainly will feel familiar to you. But it's an incredible piece that McKay did. And we spend a good chunk of time, not just talking about his piece, but sort of understanding sort of the ecosystem that Rupert Murdoch created and what it has done in at least the three places he's had the most success in acquiring media organizations: Australia, the UK, and of course here in the United States. But let's be honest, one of the reasons why there's so much distrust of media in general is arguably due to the tactics that Rupert Murdoch has employed for some 30 years, the weaponizing of journalism for partisan ends. While he's not the first person to try and do it, I mean, I've told you this, the 19th century was filled with this type of mindset when it comes to journalism and media. But this modern era version of it and this attempt to sort of essentially weaponize the information ecosystem that we're all living in today. Arguably, the modern version of this began with the decision of what's happened with Fox News. But you'll hear an interesting conversation about how, and I'm going to leave you with this question before I go into the week in politics and what to expect this week. And that's simply this: would we be better off if Roger Ailes were still running Fox News? So I'm going to let you stew on that a minute before we get to my interview with McKay Coppins. And by the way, later this week, we talk about trust in media. Well, you want to know why there's such little trust in government? I'd argue it has to do with a certain cover-up or supposed cover-up of probably the most famous assassination of the 20th century. So with that, I want to put a pin in that and instead talk about what we learned this weekend and what to expect in the topsy-turvy world that is politics these days, and frankly, the tariff trade wars that Donald Trump has started around the world. The big news over the weekend, of course, is his decision to essentially exempt Silicon Valley as best he can from the tariffs. The question is this a permanent exemption or a temporary one? Like with everything in how Donald Trump has handled the tariff situation and the trade situation, his administration is giving mixed signals. On one hand, this looks like, hey, we can't step in front of something that has been that has allowed America to take the lead, whether it's on the development of smartphones or artificial intelligence and the big chips and all these companies that desperately need this tech imported without big tariffs. They got their exemptions on that front, but the Commerce Secretary went out there on the Sunday shows and said, hey, these are only going to be temporary. So is this a permanent exemption? Is this a temporary exemption? And what does it mean to start handing out exemptions? If you recall, in the previous iteration of the ToddCast, I had a couple of experts on trade and tariffs, and we were talking about what could be, and this was back before the November election. But sort of like, what is it about tariffs that Donald Trump just loves so much? And what tariffs do when you start to implement them the way he implemented them, very scattershot, is that it puts him at the center of every single negotiation. If you're a country with tariffs slapped on you, you've got to go to Donald Trump. You're not going to some other entity, some other multinational, trade agreement that you try to renegotiate. You have to go to Donald Trump. And if you're an industry impacted by tariffs, and you're looking for an exemption so that you continue to do business in a reasonable way, you got to go to Donald Trump. And this is why he loves it. He loves to be able to be in the middle of a one-on-one deal. And if you're wondering if the goal of the tariff policy is to achieve what he wants to achieve, which is to bring manufacturing back to America, then he's undermining his own policy with all of these exemptions. If you continue to give the tech industry all of these exemptions, they have no incentive to break ground in the United States of America. But you got to ask yourself, what's the motivation of Donald Trump to do this? Well, he's just trying to deal with short-term political pain, because you will see the markets briefly go up early in the week, perhaps early on Monday. Maybe it's a great day, all day Monday with the tech stocks, your Apples, your Palantirs, your Nvidias, the people that have right now have the president's ear. And of course, it's not lost on some people that here Apple's getting a big benefit here. And we all know all of the amount of money that has been given to the inaugural committee by many of these tech companies, or the library that may or may not ever exist in a future world of Donald Trump. But there is this essentially piggy bank of money and chits that he's been acquiring from these tech companies. And perhaps this is one way they've just cashed in to make sure they get these exemptions. But again, it undermines the stated goal of what they're trying to do. And if you're opening the door on this front with tech tariffs, you're going to start opening the door to other industries. And the next big industry that's going to be looking for an exemption is going to be a politically powerful one. And that is folks that are involved with anything having to do with babies, whether it's taking care, if it's bringing in the right equipment that you want to import to take care of your kid, car seats, things like that. We already know, if you remember the baby formula crisis, and they had to temporarily waive tariffs in order to try to save money there. When people start complaining about the cost of their coffee, are the coffee importers going to get an exemption? And is Donald Trump going to sit here and essentially play whack-a-mole with ways to try to soften the economic blow to the public? That's what this looks like so far. And if you do that, this is no way to run an economy. This is not, it is going to end up blowing up both goals that he might have. If he's trying to stabilize the economy by trying to do some of these exemptions, okay, there's some sort of uneasy stabilization here, right? In the tech stocks, maybe you'll have uneven stabilization. There'll be relief that the cost of an iPhone isn't going to be so much that it impacts the earnings of Apple. And then maybe, those that lobby the administration when it comes to the various things that impact having a baby and taking care of kids in this country, and you get rid of the tariffs on anything having to do with baby formula or car seats or strollers or things like that. Okay, so then there's that. And then every industry starts coming to the White House for something. And it means everything is a transaction. Now, look, the darker part of my brain is going to the world of a kleptocracy. This is how a kleptocracy is. Okay, before you go to a full-fledged authoritarian regime, you go through this sort of midpoint between democracy and authoritarianism, which is kleptocracy. Arguably, that's what Turkey is right now. That is what Venezuela is times 100, where there's still some remnants of a democracy. Maybe in Turkey, for instance, the actual vote itself isn't rigged, but all of the industries are essentially, you got to pay some sort of fee or honorarium or whatever you want to call it to the government in order to be able to do business in certain ways. And suddenly, when you're at the center of a tariff regime that Donald Trump has put on, every industry is coming, and they're going to be coming a little bit with hat in hand and perhaps an offering or two. And what is that offering? Sometimes we may know. Sometimes it's a quid pro quo that he may claim will help the country, and sometimes it may be a quid pro quo that helps one of his friends or himself. Some of this stuff will be transparent, and some of this stuff will be opaque. But even the very idea that this economy, we no longer, under a system like this, can say we have a free market economy. Our economy is being dictated by government intervention. And there's some irony to this, because right now it is the folks on the right that like to talk about folks on the left wanting a socialized government, wanting socialism in this country. Well, when you're attempting to control and manipulate business, that is the very definition of getting into the world of nationalism and socialism. And there really isn't a lot of difference, right? He may proclaim himself a nationalist, but the ability to manipulate an economy is something that socialist governments want to do as well. So in many ways, he is now practicing his own form, call it national socialism. I'll let you go down that rabbit hole when you make that phrase and have some fun with that phrase. But this is where we're headed. And now that he's been willing to cut a deal with tech, others are coming. What does this do to the overall tariff regime? I think it only is going to continue to create long-term concern about the stability of the economy. And everything that his stated goal is, which is to essentially redo the manufacturing sector in this American economy, doing all of these sort of half in, half out, all of this, it is not incentivizing business to break ground in this country. It is incentivizing business to wait him out or buy him out, right? They might buy him out by getting an exemption, hope they can survive maybe 2 years till the midterms, 4 years until the next presidential, and then we go back to the global economy that, frankly, is already there and probably impossible to end. You might be able to slow it down. You might be able to take an industry here, an industry there, and try to manipulate it for a couple of years. But ultimately, it is going to be really hard to stop the movement of progress. You can slow it down. You could possibly cause equity markets to freeze. You can certainly disrupt things. But the long term is going to be impossible to stop. And the short term at this point, I think he's hoping that by doing these whack-a-moles, he can minimize the inflationary impact on people's pocketbooks. The next month or two, probably folks aren't going to see too much inflation. But starting around June 1st, when all of the inventories that people have already accumulated in this country without the big tariffs are completely sold out and sold out and are sort of brought back down, that's when you're going to start to see the increases. And then the question is he going to continue to do these whack-a-moles? When the 90-day pause expires, does he extend it another 90 days? Do we have extensions of 30 days at a time? A lot of it's going to depend on the perception of the economy. A lot of it's going to be about the actual bond market itself. Is it collapsing still? Is the price of the dollar continuing to go down, threatening our status as the reserve currency? So, look, this has been a can of worms that he's opened up. He is trying to play whack-a-mole here. I don't think this is going to go well, but we're going to see. My guess is the markets react okay on the early part of the week, and then reality is going to set in. You realize this instability. Who speaks for the administration? Is it the Commerce Secretary? Is it Peter Navarro? Is it Scott Bessent? Is it Donald Trump? Right? We know it's Donald Trump ultimately, but who's got his ear at any given moment? That to me seems to be an open question. So prepare for another tumultuous week. As you see, by the way, his poll numbers continue to erode. They're going to continue to go down. This is not, there has been no positive coverage. He has no ribbon cuttings of new factories. He is, I've gone through this before, but he couldn't have politically mishandled the rollout of this tariff regime any worse. There are better ways this could have been done. I told you about how Owen Cass, who's somebody who is ideologically essentially trying to defend what Trump is doing, but he actually had a better, more coherent, methodical plan to do this than what this administration has done. And they've likely set themselves up for just what's going to continue to be political pain in the polls, financial instability in the markets, and a lot of uncertainty with our international relationships. Let me sneak in a break here, and when we come back, my conversation with McKay Coppins on the future of Rupert Murdoch's empire. And joining me now is the author of this, frankly, it feels like a mini book, a novella, if you will, except it's real life. It is not. It is nonfiction, even if it reads like incredible fiction, is McKay Coppins of The Atlantic. McKay, it's good to talk with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Chuck.
So first, I want to get more of your sort of credentials and accolades out of the way. You are the author of a book that I've been using as a teaching tool for students in my I teach a class of USC students that are interning in D.C., and the class is called How Washington Works, and I give them sort of 4 or 5 books to choose from as a midterm assignment, and one of them is the Romney book.
Oh, wow, that's awesome. Thank you.
Because I think I look at it this way. There's sort of a few books right now that I feel like are perfect, almost textbooks for understanding politics these days, which is, how did the Republican Party move from the Eisenhower Romney era to this Trump era?
Mhm.
And Mitt Romney, your Romney book, where Mitt Romney essentially gave you incredible access to his innermost thoughts, I think does better job of any book out there of showing that evolution. And when you're trying to put together, you want to understand Washington these days, you got to understand the evolution of the Republican Party. Your book does that. There's a great book by Roy Teixeira about where have all the Democrats gone. That
Mm-hmm.
explains the Democrat. It's so I use this piecemeal. There's Brody
That's
Mullins's book.
awesome.
The Mullins brothers did that great book about the lobbying community. That's my textbook for lobbying. So it is a reminder that I think the best journalism these days is in this long form element that we're
Mhm.
in. But look, I booked you because of this incredible access you got with the Murdoch family, where whether the Succession was real life Murdochs or not, the great HBO show, um, it is a reminder. No matter how you fictionalize something, the reality is so much weirder, so
Yeah,
much more
man.
important. Let me just start with before we get it. By the way, I love that the Atlantic magazine tells you how many minutes it will take to read said article. We are going to be talking for less time than it will take to
Yeah.
get through the whole thing.
Hopefully
Let me
it doesn't feel like too much of a slog. It is long,
No,
but it's
it's not a slog. I
but
mean,
I know when you write something that long, the thought is like you have to take extra care to make sure it's not boring because you'll lose people,
correct.
you know?
I mean, other than the time element here, how tempting is it to do a full book? Or in some ways, would James not have cooperated? James Murdoch, who clearly is the most important narrator here for you,
hmm You know,
if it was that part of the bargain that it wasn't going to be a book?
we didn't even talk about it being a book, and I have to say, like about a few months into the process, it kind of occurred to me that this maybe should have been a book, or at least, first of all, it might have been more lucrative, although The Atlantic pays me very well, et cetera. But
Yes,
I think that there's an urgency element to it.
agreed.
As much as this is kind of a timeless story, and we talk about how the
Hmm.
Murdochs kind of resemble these dynastic families throughout history. It
Right.
also the Murdoch. I was catching the Murdochs at this moment where the family was melting down over the control of the empire, and the problem with a book is that like that's a multi-year process to get it out, and who knows how things would have changed by then. So I really appreciated that the Atlantic could get it into the bloodstream at this kind of moment.
I actually, as if I were playing book editor or book publisher, I probably would have said, you know what, you got to get it out now. Do it as a
Yeah.
and who knows? Maybe you go back to the old days. It turns in you write serials, and then
Yeah,
all of a
yeah,
sudden somebody goes ahead and turns it into a book
totally.
a few years from now. But look, the urgency, and I agree that there's urgency here. What happens to the Murdoch Empire will have a profound impact on how the Trump right wing, and I do think it's
hmm
sort of that version of the right wing, the populist right wing in around the Western world, not just
Yeah,
in America, how they communicate with voters, right? How they communicate their message.
yeah.
Who controls the Murdoch empire? There's others nipping at their heels, right? In America, it's Newsmax. There's ones in the UK. There's ones in Australia. So this will have a profound impact on our politics, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's what made the story what gave it stakes, right? Because
Mhm.
on one level, this is like a human drama about this
Oh, it's a
family that's
soap opera.
unraveling. And
Yeah,
if
it's
you
a
watch
classic soap opera.
Succession, it will feel very familiar. Or if, frankly, you read Greek tragedies, it might feel familiar as
Yes.
well.
Yeah.
King Lear, Shakespeare, whatever. But the stakes are that this is, I think, arguably the most powerful,
Hmm.
certainly conservative media empire in the Western world, one of
Right.
the most powerful media empires in the world. And they have become very deliberately the organ of this right-wing populism that you're talking about. And
Right.
it's we see it in Fox News here in the US, but this empire, these media outlets have played a key role in Brexit. They played a key
Yep.
role in toppling governments around Europe. I mean, they know. if these outlets change hands and the direction changes, it
Hmm.
dramatically changes how politicians throughout the English speaking world on the right connect with their audiences.
I mean, let's narrow it down here. We're talking Australia, the UK, and the United States. I mean,
Yeah,
that's where he's
that's
had
right.
the
That's right.
most where truly his media empire has either served as an organ of political power or as a sorter of political power,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing that connects all of them is that there's always been, and this goes back to the very beginning in Australia, this kind of like puckish anti-establishment streak, right? That defines all from the first Australian newspapers that Rupert bought to the tabloids on Fleet
Hmm.
Street to certainly Fox News. Um, the Murdoch press is really good at identifying kind of the sacred cows of
Hmm.
the liberal or centrist and liberal establishment and like slaying them, right? Needling.
Yeah.
But that has I think that and there, you can still see some of that, but in the last 20 years and certainly in the last decade, you've seen that kind of curdle into this full-throated support for something that critics would argue is more illiberal and more toxic than just kind of like mischief making.
I was just gonna say, look, the New York Post of the '90s was fun, right? The New York
Yes,
Post
right.
of the New York Post of today is predictable and brutish, I guess,
Yes.
is what I
Yeah.
would describe it as, you know.
Yeah.
And Fox feels that way. There was a time, I mean, there's actually an individual. I think about a guy like Greg Gutfeld, who I knew when he
Hmm.
was the editor at Maxim UK, and he was just a provocateur,
Yeah.
but intellectually honest about it,
Hmm.
right? And even as a comedian, but in
You
some
had Dennis
ways,
Miller on Fox,
right?
playing
But
kind of a similar
right, and
role.
now it's almost like nope, they have to be on a message, right?
Yeah.
They've lost what there was a rebelliousness to them
Yes,
that made it
exactly.
interesting, and now instead of being a rebel still, right? They're weirdly their own establishment.
Yeah, it's like it's an organ of the kind of populist right establishment. Makes them less interesting for
I
sure.
think it
And
does, right? It made it less sticky at
it
times.
also makes the Murdoch family and Rupert in particular, I think, less powerful in a way because for so long he was the one kind of making the weather on the right,
Hmm.
And now it really does feel like ever since Donald Trump arrived on the scene, at least in America, he is the one making the weather. And Rupert had to kind of make a decision about like, are we getting on board with this or not? And basically decided he was.
Right. Both Brexit and Trump were that way,
Yeah.
and this was a case. Look, I think the problem with media in general is that a lot of traditional media followed the Murdoch model here. Murdoch
Hmm.
chose to follow the viewers, to
Yeah.
follow the readers. Wait a minute. Our readers are anti-immigrant. We better do this now. Even though he wanted to be pro-immigration, right?
Yeah.
He wanted to do
Yeah.
this until Rush Limbaugh told him otherwise. And it
Hmm.
wasn't that he told him that. It's this they realized, oh, our
Yep.
entire listening audience. So that was the first moment where Rupert realized, I think, that he couldn't make the weather. Somebody else was
Hmm.
actually in charge of it. And then what's ironic is that everybody else followed suit, right? I think the biggest problem with media right now is too many people catering to their audience,
It's an
right?
audience capture, right?
And
This is
and, and they're 100%.
and I think about this all the time. In my early years of my career worked for Ben Smith at BuzzFeed, and
Hmm.
at the time, BuzzFeed News, the whole idea was we're going to be the news outlet that speaks to the social web, and we
Hmm.
write these stories that go viral on Twitter or Facebook or whatever. And Ben ended up, a couple of years ago writing this book declaring the end of the social media era and that, the new media era is about, cultivating these audiences and subscription models and all that
Yeah.
stuff, right? And I think he's right, but it's funny because I'm now kind of, for all the problems the social media era had in media, I'm a little nostalgic for it because we really were trying to write for as broad an audience as possible. And what's happened is now with the fragmentation of the media landscape, everybody has just been able to figure out, this is my audience of
Right.
In Fox News's case, 4 million people. In like a Substack writer's case, my audience is 1,500 people, but they're willing to pay me, and I tell them exactly what they want to hear 3 times a week. And I think that's a real problem for the news media.
Look, I'm going about this thinking that there's still an audience out there that just sort of wants a sort of a rational, analytical view of what's happening. And I'm trying to attack it like a political anthropologist. And that's how I sort of have always viewed my role, is that I'm more of an anthropologist about our politics and our media than anything else, where I certainly have my own opinions, but I am more of like, okay, but how is this all interacting and creating the politics that we have versus the politics that we want? And so,
wait, can I ask you, Chuck?
Because the difficulty is there isn't a constituency there per se.
Yeah.
Other than, but
it's not a political constituency.
Correct.
Is the thing. It's not,
and a lot of this is gathering as political.
Yeah. Well, and that was my question. Do you? I know this is your show, but the one question I'll ask you: do you feel that pull, like the pull of the audience, like wants a certain thing from you, and that you don't?
No, it's the other way around. It's why I left.
Interesting.
NBC, because I actually felt as if the business of NBC was more worried about the audience that it had, not the audience that it wanted.
Interesting.
And it's not just them, right? This is where all traditional media, and it's understandable, right? It's a business decision. It's not necessarily what's in the best interest of the ecosystem. And it is. I will tell you this: the easy way to do this is to pick a side. Right.
Totally.
It's what Megyn Kelly made this decision, right? We know we've seen her own discomfort with what the politics of this era is, but she chose to make a living. God bless her, right? I think she's, I think this is a very talented broadcaster who made the choice that if we take a side, then we can maybe be the most trusted media person for the Trump right.
Right.
By the way, there's nothing wrong, just like there's people the most trusted on the left, right? For that. That is, and I don't see it as I don't lament this. I think that's I think that's healthy as long as there's a lot of this out here, and there's almost an acceptance that, hey, you're actually only speaking to a small slice of the electorate, no matter how large your slice looks.
Right.
In comparison to the entire ecosystem, right?
Yeah, and there's a role for, being the kind of person that grounds whatever your political constituency is, grounds it in reality, gives it facts, maybe helps them understand an intellectually honest way to make their arguments, as opposed to a ridiculous.
Well, I look at it, people hate this. I do compare it to sports in this way. I can't stand listening to, Yankees announcers broadcast a Yankees game, because I want an honest portrayal of the game. I don't want the Yankee perspective, right?
Yeah.
And so I am surprised at the number of people that think that just live in the right or the left wing ecosystem and don't want a reality check. Now, I happen to think this is where everything is cyclical. Right, which is, the late 19th century and the early 20th century was all partisan media.
Yes.
Until we all got tired of it, right? And so I do think there's a moment here, and that's what I mean. We're in a fragmented world again, just like we were in the early days of magazines, the early days of the muckrakers, early days of radio. Yeah. And then we will, there'll be winners and losers. There'll be the big curators, the big networks, and you'll have it may be, and we're going to get to the Murdochs here, it may be that Megyn Kelly's the next Rupert Murdoch, and we just don't realize it yet.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And she creates her own new conservative ecosystem because the Murdochs fracture completely, which brings me back to your story and James. Before we get into some of the details, when James started talking with you, at what point did you realize that Succession have an insider account? You delved into this.
Yeah.
Or was it simply there just were a predictable dynastic family and it was actually easy to write?
It was the weirdest thing about doing these interviews was that, I remember the first few interviews I did with James and his wife, Catherine, was also a big part of it. I would have these experiences where they'd be telling me a story and I'd have this weird deja vu where I'd be like, I feel like I've heard this story before.
Yeah.
And they're like, no, we've never told this to anybody. And I was like, well, has it been reported? And then I would realize it was a storyline on Succession. And that's why it was familiar. There is this, you alluded to this whole parlor game among the Murdochs about who was leaking to the writers. Like everyone in the family is obsessed with the show. Even James, who claims that he never watched it beyond the first episode, still has theories about who was leaking to the writers. James and Catherine
Just
thought that.
because you don't watch the show doesn't mean you don't read every review of it.
Well, and everybody in his life watches it and wants to talk to him about it, and it's all
Hmm.
out there, right? And
Hmm.
they thought that his sister Liz was leaking to the writers.
Hmm.
Liz said no, but thinks that her ex-husband was. Like, there was this whole thing. And I think at the end of the day, I should say Jesse Armstrong, I ended up finally talking to him, the creator of the show, and he just kind of laughed about it. He was like, there's this whole psychodrama with the Murdochs where they all think that somebody is leaking to us. And the reality is, we could figure out the dynamics pretty easily. They're not the most complicated, family. Like,
Well, I always say that about Donald Trump. There is no, when people ask me about, understanding Donald Trump, I said, it's not hard.
yeah,
He's arrested development. He's 13. He's constantly 13. And like every 13-year-old, there are moments of adulthood and moments of stupidity.
yep.
And he is transactional, and it's very simple. He wants power and attention and affection and all these things. And it's like,
Mhm.
I think that's what I took away here, is that the Murdochs are actually a very um, normal, dysfunctional, wealthy family.
Yeah, well, that was actually something James talked about early on, because he had that famous quote from Anna Karenina about all happy families are alike, all unhappy
Hmm.
families are different, right? Unhappy in their own way. And he was saying he doesn't actually believe that, because
Yeah, I
when
don't know if I
he
do either.
looks if he looks at the history of families like his, for example, wealthy
Yeah,
families that fracture over power and money, he
yeah,
feels like they're all pretty similar. And he sees the same patterns repeating over and over again, including in his own family. And he actually told me, I think the real tragedy here is that nobody else in my family seems to have read the history, right? Like, what is happening to my family has happened to 1,000 families before ours, and
right.
we should have all seen the warning signs and figured out how to avoid this fate.
Well, where are we in this suit? What what is it going to be, is Rupert going to be able to rewrite his trust or not?
We don't know for sure yet, but it seems like probably not. So Rupert tried to rewrite the trust. There was a year of litigation. There was a trial last fall. The
Hmm.
judge in December, or actually the probate commissioner, I should be careful here, the Reno, Nevada probate commissioner overseeing the fate
Hmm.
of this multi-billion-dollar empire, ruled against Rupert on basically every count, said he could not rewrite the trust, was not operating in good faith. Um, Rupert and Lachlan have appealed that decision. And so we are now waiting, and it could be months before a judge makes the final call. But all indications point to Rupert not being able to do this, which means that when he dies, unless something else changes,
Hmm.
uh, control of the empire will be split equally among Lachlan, James, Elizabeth, and Prudence.
Well, I want to get to that. So those are the four children that get a piece of this. What about the other children?
The two younger ones, Grace and
This is the one with
Chloe.
Wendy, right? With
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
They
Okay.
they get a significant share of the money, but no controlling vote
Hmm.
in the direction of the empire. And this was actually by design. So Rupert's second wife, Anna, who is the mother to James, Lachlan, and Liz, actually, when they got divorced 25 years ago in
Hmm.
1999, she basically said, I am willing to give up a significant portion of the money that I'm entitled to here if
Hmm.
we establish this trust that secures control of the empire with these four oldest children, including one from Rupert's
Hmm.
previous marriage. And so if he has more kids later, they can get
Right.
money, but not control of the empire. And specifically, she wanted it to be split equally because she thought, and this is kind of ironic in retrospect, that it would incentivize them all to work
Of
together,
course.
right?
Yeah.
That it would
No.
basically prevent their lives being consumed by this succession battle.
Which, by the way, what you just described I mean, that was a storyline in Succession of how
That's
the
right.
ex-wife,
Yep.
sort of had played the mediator here. Um, I'm curious. There's been a lot of speculation about Wendy and whether, that relationship and was it an operation
Hmm.
or not. I mean, to
Yeah.
be frank, right? Was it an intelligence operation? Was he honeypotted? Where does James fall on that?
James and Lachlan both, at least according to James, strongly opposed the marriage in
Yeah.
1999.
Were they
On
very
per
skeptical of her?
They were very distrustful of her. They were suspicious. They felt like she
Hmm.
couldn't be trusted. They felt like she came out of nowhere. She was this executive at the Asian satellite company that they owned. All of a
I
sudden, kind
mean,
of,
if you were to design a, John Le Carre or whatever,
right.
sort of cheap plot line here of an intelligence operation by the Chinese government, it might look something like this.
James and Catherine still will talk about how they don't trust her. Catherine actually joked to me that Wendy had evaded a subpoena in this current litigation by using a CCP issued burner phone,
Well, I, isn't
which she
like
says is a joke, but honestly, I really think there remains a lot of serious suspicion about her and
yeah.
her ties to the Chinese government and everything else.
Um,
I should say Wendy didn't respond to my request for comment. She's obviously denied being like a Chinese
right.
asset, just
Yeah.
just to cover our bases here.
No doubt she has, but her behavior since then has not helped her cause. And the relationship she is in, people she has chosen to be associated with has not helped put those rumors to rest.
She is constantly, it seems like, rumored at least to be in
Hmm.
relationships with various very powerful men
Yes.
throughout the Western world. And
Yes. Yes.
yes,
Um,
it raises questions.
um, why do I think James and Lachlan will reconcile when their dad dies?
Do you?
It's what happens in a lot of these families, right? If you just go about that, and that's why I'm curious if you could see any of that, because there's a few things. Sort of reality is a very powerful organizing force, okay?
Mhm.
And the reality of his death, and the reality of, do I want to have some access to power? Do I want to have some empire to jointly run?
Yeah.
Or do I want to take my ball and go home and just sit in litigation for 5 years and 10 years or whatever it is? Or we sell it and break it up and one gets a quarter, and it fractures. I have no doubt that's one possibility, right? Everybody takes a
Mhm.
piece and run and goes their separate ways. And Lachlan, finds right winger billionaires to fund him, and James and Catherine find whatever, either independents or left wing, but who knows, right?
Yeah.
But it could also be reconciled and they could somehow figure out how to manage this thing together. Because in some ways, it could be the father that's the divisive figure between the two of them, right? In most of
Right.
these
That
Shakespearean
is,
things, that
yeah.
once you know, look, I've got family members who it's pretty clear to me the living parent is the divide. They all seem to not get along, but they do agree about one thing: is how the parent created this distrust. My
Yeah.
guess is they probably
Right.
weirdly, even though Lachlan has Rupert on his side, he probably resents the fact that Rupert blew this.
Yeah, that is, I think that is a key insight to the dynamic. It is absolutely true that the role Rupert has played throughout his kid's life is by pitting them against each other for
100%. You could
his
see it. Yeah.
attention and affection
Yeah.
and approval. And so, yeah, you could make a case that removing him from that dynamic actually leaves these adult children now some space to kind of work out their own relationships with each other. I think that in the case of James and by the way, I would say James's sisters, I could easily see reconciling with Lachlan. Right now, I think
Mm.
they're not really talking. The
Hmm.
sisters are lined up with James in this litigation, but I could see them kind of reconciling. The question is if there's just been too much damage done to the
Mm.
specific relationship between James and Lachlan. They tried to run the companies together in 2016, 17, 18, 19. Like that, there was a moment where Rupert said, "Okay, we've resolved the succession battle.
Yeah.
They're both going to do this together. Lachlan is chairman, James
Yeah.
is CEO, and it was a disaster."
Well, but here, I'm gonna introduce a a a butterfly effect theory here, which is if Hillary Clinton is president in 2017 and not Donald
Mhm.
Trump, does Lachlan and James have more Are there more? Is it easier to come up with a strategy that makes sense for the empire versus the disruptive force that is Trump, right?
Yeah.
That had, and the disruptive force that was Brexit, right? Without Brexit and Trump, do Lachlan and James, while they may ideologically not be on the same side of the aisle, there would be more comfort working with each other because the opposing force wasn't a threat, an existential threat, the way Trump Brexit.
I could see that, and I would add that a lot of the kind of key moments of division between the two brothers when they were
Mhm.
co-running the company had to do with Trump, right? It was
Right,
Charlottesville, it was the
right,
Muslim ban, like these key early moments of that first Trump term that were frankly divisive everywhere, right? They
right.
caused countless Thanksgiving, debates in living rooms around the
Right.
world. Like it was very, it drove a huge wedge between the two
Hmm.
of them. I think that there is something to be said for that. It's also true that like Trump's arrival caused these outlets to start to remake themselves in Trump's image in a way
Hmm.
that, James could have stomached and still, honestly, I think would be okay with Fox News being a center-right outlet, right? He
Right.
still will
I
say
get that
it
sense. I
makes
think
sense.
my guess is he really is that he really is more of a probably economically center
Totally.
right and
I
maybe
think
and culturally center left.
he
Yeah.
calls himself a centrist, and I think he's where a lot of kind of wealthy centrists are, which is,
Right.
you
Want some
know,
tax cuts. Yeah.
yeah, exactly, and free markets are good, and et cetera.
Right.
I think that he he could not stomach Fox News becoming in the Trump era what it became, right?
Right.
He also, frankly, spent a lot of his time working when he was working in the family business overseas. He was in Asia and then Europe, and so Fox News, while it
So he felt the effect of anti-Americanism in some ways, didn't he?
and then he came back and Fox News was like I think it hurt he didn't realize quite how much Fox News defined the entire empire until he came back to America and realized that he's like we're doing all these great things in India and Hong Kong and we have this huge media apparatus in Britain and all anyone wants to talk to me is about Sean Hannity and like I think that it really underscored for him how much it had kind of polluted the Murdoch name and also made it harder for him to expand the empire in ways that he wanted to.
One of my theses about Fox News is how off the rails it went after Roger Ailes left.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
that Roger Ailes was actually a more stabilizing force. Roger Ailes actually understood that you actually had to have journalists in order to give credibility to the nighttime guys, right? I actually think if Roger Ailes were alive today, he would not like that they had basically benched all their journalists,
Yeah,
right?
totally.
I've always said Fox has journalists, but they don't practice journalism as a network, right? But they have individuals who do, right? Your
Hmm.
Jennifer Griffins and folks like that. And Britt Hume, even as an
Yeah.
analyst, still is sort of a newsman first, right? You see it, you feel it in him because that's just who he is. And um, I'm curious, because I know James, it wasn't a big Ailes fan, but did that ever come up? Does
Oh,
he sort
we
of
talked
realize
totally.
that Roger actually was a more stabilizing force than maybe
I
we all realized?
Yeah, I think some of this ended up on the cutting room floor, but we talked
Hmm.
about, he was appalled by Roger Ailes' personal behavior, and
Yep.
he was actually privy to the
Oh, it's
findings of that
horrendous. I'm
internal
not defending
investigation.
it, and I want to,
No,
yeah, I want to make
but
that clear.
I'm
But
just bringing that up because what he said is that, what he realized once Rupert stepped in to be the interim CEO of
yes.
Fox News, was that there was a benefit to having Roger Ailes, who's basically like operated like an authoritarian leader of Fox News, but ruled with an iron fist over the
Hmm.
talent there, right? And he had a very clear vision of what Fox News should be. There should be news during the day. There should be provocation and opinion at night. And but he always maintained the belief that nobody is bigger than Fox News, right? And you had all these cases where he would toss somebody like Glenn Beck, if Glenn Beck was getting a little too
Hmm.
big for his britches and wouldn't be a team player, and Rupert got in there and he just was totally outmatched by the talent, I think. Like the hosts were running wild, they were doing whatever they wanted. And Rupert just had either no ability or no interest in trying to rein them in. And Fox News really did become much more of a kind of inmates running
Yeah.
the asylum
Oh.
situation after
No,
Roger
they
was
have
gone.
no leader. They're leaders now. It is one of those, just like the channel feels like they follow the audience.
Yeah,
The media executives let the talent,
yeah.
decide, right? They have totally ceased trying to be any sort of, I don't
And
know,
this
governing force, I guess
total,
is.
and this was a key moment though, because I will say, I report about this in the piece. When Roger Ailes left, there was this
Mhm.
big debate between Lachlan and James about who should replace him. And
Yeah.
James wanted what's the CBS guy, David Rhodes. He
David
wanted
Rhodes. Yeah. Right.
David Rhodes to come in and replace Roger Ailes and basically build Fox News into a center-right journalistic outfit with
Hmm.
editorial guardrails and
The Wall
a
Street Journal.
yeah, exactly.
Think of it like to be just, the
Like
Wall Street Journal,
Wall Street
essentially.
Journal on cable, right?
Right. Yep.
And Lachlan was adamantly opposed to this. They went back and
Mhm.
forth and bickered and fought for a while. And then Rupert finally stepped in and resolved it by saying, I'll just be the CEO. But you wonder what would have changed. Like if James had gotten his way, you actually could have seen a situation where I don't think a David Rhodes led Fox News would have been airing rigged election conspiracy theories after 2020, for example. And
Right.
and this is, I think, what's at stake now. If James gets his way when Rupert's
Hmm.
gone, Fox News and other outlets that he believes are really reckless purveyors of kind of
Yeah.
misinformation will be turned into either dismantled and sold off or turned into real,
But
news
the irony,
outlets.
but McKay, the irony to this is by the time James and Lachlan get control of this, right? Because Rupert, you know, I mean, look, he seems to, he's in his 90s, and it's like, I mean,
Yeah.
who knows, right? The actuary tables are the actuary tables.
He does. There are no indications that he's nearing death. He is healthy
Did
by
he end
all.
up getting married or not
He
again?
did. Yes, he got
So
married again.
there is another
There's
wife,
a
right? Yeah.
fifth or sixth wife, I think
Yeah.
sixth.
No
Yeah,
kids with this one, right?
right.
That we know of.
Yes,
Okay.
no. The only kids are with Wendy and Anna, and then his first wife.
Right. So by the time James and Lachlan get control of this, I mean, one of the things I think that the Fox News hosts have realized is, you know, um, there's always someone else willing to go further than them, and there's always an audience that's willing to follow
Yes,
the person that goes further than them. Like, I just don't know if I think the toothpaste is out of the tube, and the problem is Fox is never going to be, they're never going to be able to chase Newsmax or OAN, right?
right.
Those guys are willing to literally be arms of RT if they have to. And so I don't know if it's possible to I mean the smarter thing to do would be to zag while everybody else is zigging, but I don't know if they'll know how to do that by the time
Yeah,
they get
and
control
I
of it.
mean this is the big caveat when we talk about the stakes here. Like
Hmm.
we are now in a media environment where there are so many competitors and insurgents in that space on the right,
Hmm.
that if Fox News disappeared from the planet tomorrow,
I don't think
I
anything
don't
changes. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, certainly the media landscape would be scrambled, but I'm not sure that audience ends up in a much more responsible information ecosystem.
No, I don't either.
You do see Fox trying to position themselves for this future, right? They recently acquired Red Ventures, which is the podcast distributor for Megyn Kelly and a bunch of
Right.
other prominent
And Fox Nation
conservative
is
voices.
kind of their attempt at sort of
Yep,
making sure that
yep.
if YouTube is the future, they're going to have a significant place in it too,
And
right?
and again, I think that this is the case that Lachlan and Rupert are making, which is
Hmm.
basically this is this is what the empire was built on, right?
Hmm.
This is our value add proposition. We can't abandon this audience. We need to just be doing everything we can to hold on to this audience
Hmm.
and the next generation of conservatives. And James would tank our ability to do that.
So what does James want to do now?
So James, when he left the company in 2019 after the Disney sale, which
Hmm.
he played a big role in negotiating the sale of the film
Do they regret
studio.
that, by the way, selling that off
The
and
Murdochs
shrinking?
definitely no,
Yeah,
I don't think well, Lachlan, I think, was always against it because he didn't like that it made the empire much smaller and less
sure did.
glamorous.
Yeah,
But if you look at the number they got, the number that
yeah.
they got is wildly inflated. Analysts now will
Well,
tell you that they sold at the very height
oh,
of what the
and you know who
value
they have to
was.
thank for that? Brian Roberts at
Brian,
Comcast,
yeah,
who
that's
drove
right.
up the
Because
sale
Brian,
price
that's
because,
exactly
he
right.
wanted, it was, we were, there was this whole, you could argue there was sort of this land grab, right, of
Hmm.
content
Right.
in that one moment,
We need the
where
IP. We need all the
that's right.
IP we can
Everybody
possibly
wanted to
get to
grab
feed our streamers, you
oh,
know?
it was this, constant. And so, and it's the best thing that happened to Comcast is that they
That's right.
didn't get saddled with it.
Oh my
And
gosh.
frankly, I think they regret buying Sky, right?
Well, and
Which they also acquired
oh,
from Fox.
interesting.
Yeah.
And James, that was like his white whale forever. He wanted to buy Sky, and they just couldn't get it done because
Hmm.
the public profile was just too toxic for News Corp and Fox. But the point is, James left that when he left after that sale,
Hmm.
he got $2 billion in cash. All the siblings did. Um, so he set himself
It's not a
up,
bad
and
consolation prize.
yeah,
Yeah.
and he's kind of building his own little mini empire, right?
Yeah.
And it's very kind of Jamesian. He's bought controlling stake in Art Basel and
Mm.
the Tribeca Film Festival, or like he's investing in India again, which is where he started his career, and
Hmm.
he's kind of building up his own portfolio. Um, and I think he's fine with that. And when Rupert's gone, there is a possibility that Lachlan just goes to James and says, "Let me just buy you out." Like
Yeah.
I'll let and there have been buyout attempts before, but James always felt like they were lowballing him. It's
Right.
possible that Lachlan says, and maybe even before Rupert dies, maybe Rupert is the catalyst for it, but maybe Rupert says, "Look, let's just we tried this kind of scheme, it didn't work.
Yeah.
Let's just go
Let's
straight to him, give him exactly what he wants for his stake." And James walks away an even wealthier man with the freedom to
right.
build whatever he wants.
And you assume the sisters go along with whatever James wants to go along
It
with on
it
this?
would be no, I think they would make their own decision, but I think that Prudence in particular has never shown any interest in the business at
Hmm.
all. She would probably, I'm speculating here, but probably be happy with just taking her money and
Hmm.
going home. Liz is more of a wild card. Liz is actually a very successful TV and film developer in her own right.
Yeah.
She's set up her own production company. But Liz, Prue, and James are all embarrassed by Fox News and by kind of the
Right.
more right-wing elements of the company. So if they don't see a way to reforming it, I think
Yeah.
they would want to just kind of wash their hands and walk away.
Well, it's interesting. Look, I think there's going to be an existential moment for Fox that comes up because the NFL has decided that they want to opt out of their TV deal,
Mhm.
and this is going to be a huge decision by Fox and whether they're going to financially try to keep up with Google and Apple and Amazon, who all are suddenly, what the NFL sees. Although I do wonder if the tariff environment, if the economy is as bad as I think it could end up being in the next year or two, we may see a situation where there's no ad market is collapsing
Yeah.
and the NFL backtracks. But um, I wonder whether Fox is going to have the resources to keep up because that's it. The NFL is such an important part of them having a foothold in legitimacy,
Oh,
right?
no
Like
question.
Fox News is becoming less and less legitimate. It's becoming more and more of a pariah. But Fox Sports is
Yep.
the narrator of our sports lives in many cases with the
Hmm.
NFL, and it's such a huge. If they lost it, but it may become financially impossible to keep.
I mean, this is the position that all of these broadcast
Mhm.
networks are in. Like,
Yep.
how do you compete with something like Amazon or Apple, where they just
Apple doesn't
literally
need to
have?
make money on
That's the
this
thing.
streaming. They don't care. Neither
They
does
could
Amazon.
light
Yes.
billions of dollars on fire to outbid them. And these big tech companies are coming for them. And I will say this was something that Rupert saw coming down the line, and it's part of why he sold the Disney assets, because he
Right.
kind of, or the assets to Disney, he kind of realized we're not going to be big enough to compete with the Netflixes of the world,
Right.
right? We're not, it's not possible. And so he basically decided, let's whittle this back down to the thing I actually care about, which is news. And maybe that ends up being the right call. It's a much smaller
Hmm.
business, but it is more in line with what Rupert cares about.
Is there a third generation of Murdochs that are adults yet? And I think they're so, right? And
Yeah,
do they want
young
in on this?
adults.
Yeah. Do they want in on this? Are they a part of it? What did you learn?
I did not talk to James and Catherine's kids. I met one of them, but they're
Mhm,
pretty adamant about keeping their kids out of the press, and I
mhm.
understand why, given
Well, of
what James
course.
has been
Yeah.
through. Um, but no, one thing James and Catherine did tell me is that they are gratified by the fact that they have three kids. They're all on very different career paths, and they have taken pains to not
Hmm.
try to draw them into whatever kind of professional world they inhabit because
Hmm.
James feels like he lost a good chunk of his life to just trying to play in his dad's sandbox, and they would rather let their kids kind of figure out their own way.
Ultimately, Rupert was a news guy. He
Hmm.
loves to read a newspaper. He loved, the stories of him calling up editors constantly.
Yeah.
He loved. Ultimately, he loved being provoked by his newspaper columnists. He loved that stuff. What is James and what is Lachlan? Are
Yeah.
they ultimately news guys? Are they ultimately curious guys, or are they media executive mogul types? And they're more mogul thinking rather than,
Yeah.
like I said, Rupert. Look, I I sense that Rupert cares about the Wall Street Journal's reputation,
Oh,
right? He
sure.
does,
Yes.
right? So there's,
Yeah.
it's sort of like Darth Vader. There's some good in him somewhere, right? That at least sees what a good newspaper like can
Well,
do.
another way to put it is that Rupert realizes that one of the great pleasures of being a media baron is that you get to have these outlets that kind of needle the powerful, even when
Mhm.
the powerful are on your side. And so you see the Wall Street Journal taking Trump to task over tariffs over and over again. I think,
And the New York Post. It's
and I think,
interesting that
yeah,
those two are doing it, and the assumption is that's Rupert has no control over Fox,
right,
but if he calls up Paul Gigot
totally.
at the Wall Street Journal, or if he calls up his buddies over at the Post, they'll listen.
I think that to answer your question, Lachlan and James are very different. Lachlan is, a kind of rugged outdoorsman. He's most at home in Australia. He
Hmm.
likes being a big shot. He was for a long time in Australia, this big shot media investor. His wife was the
Hmm.
host of Australia's Next Top Model. They are very much in that they're swimming in those waters of just kind of the corporate elite world, right?
Hmm.
And I don't know how much he cares about news. James is actually a pretty voracious consumer of news, but it's
Hmm.
not for the most part, the kind of news that the Murdoch press creates, right? He
Hmm.
doesn't read, I think, the New York Post. He said even when he was running all of Europe and Asia, he didn't read the news of the world and kind of the down market tabloids because it just wasn't his speed. He reads the New York Review of Books and The Atlantic, the New Yorker. He was just texting me about a
He's an
New Yorker
elite.
article. I mean,
He's
he
an
is. He
elite.
is. He's the kind of person that Greg Gutfeld makes fun of, right?
Right.
Like, but because of that, I would argue that also he really liked being involved in the movie stuff, and he's
Hmm.
like knows Wes Anderson and stuff like that. I think that he actually has more interest in the media
Hmm.
business than Lachlan in some ways, but it's part of the reason that he has a very different vision than his brother and father for
Yeah.
what the outlets should be.
Um, it's not lost on me that as you described the Murdoch kids, that that we're probably a decade away from the Trump family imploding like
Mm.
this. I know we
Hmm.
don't see it yet, but it's sort of like it seems inevitable that these family-run companies always turn to this,
Once
especially
there's
when you have
enough,
once there's a patriarch that actually
yes,
does pit kids against each other, which Donald Trump in many ways is very similar to Murdoch.
totally,
There is a familiarity to the two of them, and I've watched the way he works Eric versus Junior versus
totally.
Ivanka versus Jared and all this stuff. You know, right now they're all swimming in the same pool, but we can all see this coming. It's just
I
sort of
I actually
how big is it?
I actually wrote a cover story for The Atlantic 6 years ago about the Trump family and
Hmm.
the kind of battle between Ivanka and Don Jr. At that time. That was kind of the
Hmm.
defining uh, beef about who would be kind of the heir to the Trump
Hmm.
empire. And the interesting thing with them is that Trump, for a long time, and still to some extent, prefers Ivanka as the face of his family because he always kind of wanted to be on the inside. He wanted the kind of Manhattan
Yeah,
elite crowd to accept him. But Don Jr. was the one who actually went to where Trump's real base is and
yes,
understands
he
them
did.
better. And you can sense the kind of way that Trump resents Don Jr. for that, because on some level I think he looks in the mirror and with his son and sees himself and doesn't like what he sees. But the
Well,
fact that Don Jr. is more
yeah.
successful than Ivanka in this world, it kind of
Well, what's
bothers.
interesting is I actually go deep. I go a little bit. It's sort of what happened with his dad, right?
Mhm.
Fred, the son who Fred gave his name to, disappointed him,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Fred Jr. did, and he ends up favoring the son, and there's probably, we don't know this for sure because Fred's never, by the time Fred might have spoken about it, he'd already sort of was slipping away. But you do get a sense that, at least in my sort of study of and research of this, that there was almost a disappointment that Fred wasn't the guy, right? Fred was
yeah.
supposed to be the
Yep,
guy, and he wasn't.
yep.
It was Junior, and I think it was Donald, and then when you have Donald, you see, who does he trust to run the business? Not Junior. He trusts
No,
Eric, and it's
no.
not lost on me. Eric does all the deals. Eric
Yeah.
does that, and Eric. But then there's little superficial things. Eric's taller than Junior. Eric has blonde hair.
Blonde.
Eric
Yep.
has, I have, it is, and you could always tell there's been this weird relationship between father and son, junior and senior, because that what Donald cares about is what his name looks like, right?
Uh-huh.
His brand is with one son. So he probably can never live up to senior.
Yep.
And there's no doubt to me, Junior's constantly trying to get his dad's approval. So he thought, I'll go down this political road. Okay, I'll do
Hmm.
this, right? Will this do it? And he's got him JD Vance. Will this do it?
Yeah.
I don't know if it does, right? At the end,
No,
he still has
no.
Eric running the empire. He still wants Ivanka. He won't totally push her out, but there's no doubt in my mind this is coming. The question
Yeah.
is, I mean, please, can you imagine what's going in Junior's head that his ex-wife's dating Tiger Woods and his father is going to be obsessed with hanging out with Tiger Woods?
Yep. Yep.
Right? Like, this is going
Absolutely.
to cause all sorts of bizarre, it just feels like if you're looking for the next succession, I have a feeling it's probably
It's
the Trumps.
I think that's probably right. Maybe that's the book. Maybe I end up writing the succession
Yeah.
drama of that. It's somehow even more unseemly than the Murdoch one.
Well,
But
because it will be infused with politics, right?
right.
Especially if Junior runs,
Yeah.
right? If he runs himself at some point, whether it's in 28, whether it's in 30, whatever it is, that's always been my theory, is that
Mhm.
it's Vance and Trump, right, is a ticket. And
Yeah.
that Vance and Junior, that is, not senior. And then how that will play out, right? How does Dad handle that? I don't know.
I think the last thing I'll say about this is that it reminds me of the Murdoch dynamic, in that the more successful James became, the more Rupert was threatened by him and alienated by him. And it actually drove, James thought the way to win his dad's approval was to succeed at the company his dad owned, which
That's
seems like
crazy thinking.
a pretty
Yeah.
rational
Yeah.
idea. But the more successful he became, the more power he accumulated, the more
Yeah.
wins he notched, the more Rupert kind of resented him. And I could very easily see a similar dynamic playing out with Junior and Trump.
Well, McKay, how many interviews with James and Catherine did you end up with?
Between the two of them, 15, 16, something like
Wow.
that.
And Lachlan?
Lachlan
Never?
wouldn't talk. Rupert wouldn't
Yeah.
talk. I did talk to Liz.
Okay.
She was also, in some ways, almost more helpful, because she could see the dynamic objectively a little bit from the
A little bit,
outside, right?
right?
Yeah,
Because she wasn't involved in it,
exactly.
involved
Yeah.
with the fight. Well, look, it's fantastic, and like I said
Thank
at the
you.
top, I mean, you're, you're generational in your ability to do this, and it's fantastic, it's necessary, and it's illuminating. Whether it's understanding the dynamics of what happened in the Republican Party, and again, I tell people there's no other book to read, and you read these Trump books or you read these history of the Republican Party books, and you're like, okay, they all have sort of the same anecdotes, right? Or the anecdotes are different, but it's the
They
same.
feel the same.
Right, they all feel the same. I always say every Trump book's the same. You won't believe what he tried to do, you won't
Right.
believe who stopped him,
Yeah.
and you won't believe where they headed next, right? Like, it's always like it's some version of that. And yet you tackled it in a way through sort of the last of the Mohicans, if you will, with Romney. And it was more illuminating than any supposed Trump insider book you could get on where the party is today. And I think this on media and conservative media in general has a similar feel to me.
Well,
So
I appreciate it. I appreciate all your support. You were the first person to interview me on stage about that Romney book back in 2023. It kicked off the book tour, and it really made a difference. So I appreciate
Well,
it.
you're kind to say that. I think your work is what made the difference. Let's not get that distracted there. McKay, I mean, this was, I'm sure, exhausting, a labor of love. And now you've got to, go find some. I assume you've got a couple of things you're working on now.
On to the next story, and but always searching for a confessional, influential person who wants to bare their soul to me. So if anyone listening wants to talk, you can find me.
There you go. He can be your therapist, and you don't have to pay him. There you go. McKay.
All right, thanks, Chuck.
So, do you buy our theory that perhaps Fox News would be better today if Roger Ailes were still running it and we're still alive? Anyway, I would love to hear your comments and results on that and your responses to that. By the way, don't forget to ask Chuck at thechucktodcast.com. That's where you send in your questions. That's where you send in your feedback. That's where you throw ideas out there that you'd like to see me to tackle that perhaps we haven't tackled that. And of course, later this week, I will try to answer as many of your questions. And my theme this week of sort of institutions who helped facilitate the great distrust environment that we all live in today. We just finished up media today. We're going to tackle government distrust later this week with one of the great experts these days on all things JFK. So I hope you look forward to that later in the week. And with that, I'll sign off, and I'll see you on the next episode of the Chuck ToddCast. Until we upload again.